Welcome. This is Chris and Rick Talk Guitars. That's Chris over there taking a big drink of his coffee.
Howdy.
And I'm Rick. And we had a couple listeners give us a great idea, which was to talk about pointy guitars or guitars from the 80s or guitar in the 80s. And we really appreciate that. Keep those ideas coming in. We love it because it helps us perpetuate topics to rant about in our little podcast. But we both, Chris and I, love to talk about that because it's an interesting time period for guitar. Pointy guitars became in favor. Everybody wanted a Jackson or a Charvel or BC Rich or the Super Strat. And consequently, like classic guitars like Gibson, Les Pauls, and Strats were kind of out of favor, right? Because everybody was focused on these pointy guitars with Floyd Rose. Everything had a Floyd Rose on it at that time too, because of
or a Kaler. Yeah, I think Floyd Rose was the first. I don't know which one was first. Do you know?
I think I don't know, to be honest. I want to say
a good thing to look up and know, so you can like bore people with that little nugget.
Yeah, but and so I'm always interested because I remember back then distinctly going to music stores and seeing Les Pauls and Strats for really fair prices because they just weren't moving as these Jacksons and Charvels and all these other crazy guitars were moving off the shelves because everybody wanted a pointy guitar and a bright colored guitar, and of course they had to have the dive bomb Floyd Rose too, right? Because of Eddie Van Halen. Thanks, Eddie.
I think that it was probably Eddie Van Halen who started the Super Strat craze because
exactly.
He took his chisel and shit out and made that his stripy guitars. And I'm pretty sure he probably had, kind of spearheaded the old Super Strat movement. He had a Stratocaster, but, he rammed a humbucker in the bridge and did those other things. So it's interesting. If you look at the climate, and I think there's a very different climate between the early 80s and the late 80s. So it's kind of the middle era, I think, where that really became prominent. That, pointy headstocks, every guitar manufacturer had to have a pointy headstock. Right. So I think that probably did it because Eddie Van Halen was late 80s, or not late 70s.
Late 70s, early 80s.
Yeah.
So but I blame him for that whole, like you said. I mean, I think that Strat he created was the template for what was to come in terms of guitars in the 80s, I think, and his style of play, right? Because then everybody was tapping. And everybody was using the Floyd
big squeals
and stuff. And so he really is to blame for that whole
thanks, Edward.
Sad chapter in guitar history.
Yeah, if you look, I mean, during the early 80s, I was way into like classic, metal guitar, like which I always call like pop metal because it's metal, but it's very hooky and very poppy.
Like what kind of stuff specifically?
Like Iron Maiden, Judas Priest, UFO, things like that, like the first wave British stuff. And those bands were all classic guitars, right? They had, the Gibsons and the Fenders.
Yep.
And Iron Maiden, he put that dude put a. Was it Dave Murray? He put a humbucker in his bridge pickup too.
He did.
Probably before Edward.
Exactly. Probably, I bet.
So we're coming out of that, and that kind of influenced my whole area where I focused on when I used to fantasize about guitars. I was still at that point very classic guitar oriented. I love the classics, and so we had that wave. And I don't know when it kicked off. Then you started getting bands like, was it Quiet Riot? This is like the second wave. Rat.
Yeah.
What other
all that
bands?
Hair metal
and that's pretty much where I started noticing the pointy headstock. Those dudes
Me
all
too.
Had the Super Strat pointy headstocks, and it was impossible. Your solo was like your centerpiece of like every song. Here's my solo. I got to work out my solo, and it's got to be faster and more tappy than anything else out there.
Yeah.
So it was that whole race to sound exactly the same for metal guitar players for a while, and that is when I think of the pointy headstock. That's the era I think of. And you mentioned bright colors. We both know who was responsible for that, right? That would be Steve Vai.
I was going to say
who created that. It was Ibanez.
Yes.
And he came up with a bunch of ridiculously. Always forever stuck in the 80s color schemes.
And the innovation of putting a handle up right on the guitar itself. You don't need a case, really.
Right. Well, I mean, how else are you going to carry it, right? So the monkey grip, they called it. And I don't know if his first version was a 7-string, but he definitely...
Oh my gosh, yeah.
I don't know if he was the dude that did the 7-string thing. I still don't understand. My mind doesn't go there.
I know, but I think he was one of the first guys that said, you know what, I need one more string.
Yeah,
Come on,
like,
can you do it? And they, of course they accommodated
so Tough
him.
Nell-esque. You know, this guy says this has one more.
It goes to 11, and there's one more string, yes. So, it's a weird... era for guitar, yeah, because like you say, the guitar playing itself was all just copying essentially Eddie Van Halen and different, not really different permutations of that. Like you're saying, just all kind of the same thing. It's like one guy sounding like the other guy, sounding like the other guy, they're doing the same things with these pointy, colorful guitars. And luckily, I never really got sucked into that of wanting one of those guitars, because I was always like you. I was like, I'd rather have a Les Paul or a Strat or one of those guitars. And not to say, I mean, hey, again, as we always like to say, our disclaimer: if that's what spoke to you and that's what you wanted, that's cool. But
it spoke to a lot of people, so there's a lot of people. And
I kicked myself for not buying the classic guitars back then, because
no kidding,
they were going for really reasonable prices because nobody wanted them at the time. So,
do you know who it was that actually saved the Les Paul Standard from just becoming completely obscure during that era?
No, I want to know though.
Was Slash from Guns N' Roses. They were very popular. They were stuck inside that whole hair metal thing, and they kind of poked out as the new hope for the Aerosmith-esque kind of styles. And he was as we all know, an avid Les Paul enthusiast. And the thing that's great that back then in the 80s when Appetite for Destruction was out, I really had no interest in that music. I was familiar with it, didn't pay any attention to it. It had this Ethel Merman style vocals. But much later, I'm actually now a big fan of that record. I like that record a lot. And one of the things I like about that record is in an interview with Slash one time, I recall him saying, all I ever wanted to do was make a record as good as Aerosmith's Rocks. And I'm like, well, you know what? I think you did. I mean, I kind of favor the Aerosmith, but it's a solid fucking record
for a rock,
and song for song all the way across. So I kind of think he did it. So kudos to him for attempting that and creating that. I mean, I think that record is great, not only for the music and the way it captures hard rock in that kind of desolate hair metal era, but it's a good record. And he kind of kept the Les Paul going.
I agree, and that's cool that you cited that, because I think you're absolutely right. He's a Les Paul guy through and through. I think occasionally he played other funky guitars, like he had a BC Rich Mockingbird or something, which is cool too. I dig those. But yeah, I mean, he's a Les Paul guy. If I think of Slash, it's a Les Paul in his hands, and it's that sound. I dug that record when it first came out. Just, I don't know why, it just grabbed me. I don't know. And my friend Mark and I went and saw them open for Iron Maiden.
That would have been great.
Freaking great show. Yeah. But you're right. I mean, the Ethel Merman vocals, I think, is funky. But in terms of, and I don't really care for much of the stuff they did after that, but that first album, I think, is, like you say, a good rock album. It's classic. I mean, a lot of people mention it as a seminal rock album. I think it is up there. And in terms of guitar, saving kind of a classic guitar tone and model, Slash has to be credited with that. And again, I would say too, the indie genre, I think, helped usher in a love for more vintage instruments too.
Absolutely.
Like all those guys were buying cheap Fenders and using Fender amps and all this other stuff, and then these cheaper models became popular, kind of like we were talking about with Leslie West playing a Junior back in the day. Nobody wanted those guitars. He was onto it.
Student guitars.
Yeah,
I'm not a student.
Exactly. But he was onto them, and he dug them, and then sure enough, as time went on, people were like, these, or Mott the Hoople, those guys, they were smart. They loved these.
Leslie West turned them onto it, so that's where it came from.
But so I think what's cool about these different cycles of music is how a lot of these people kind of harken back to these old instruments and these old things that they kind of go, these are really cool, and they're cheap, right? At the time, some of it's a combination of yearning for that classic stuff and also not having a lot of money to spend on gear, and so they wind up with a Mustang or a Bronco or something like that, playing through a cool old Fender, who knows what,
Right. No, it's interesting that you mentioned the 80s independent music, because personally, my journey I came out of the 70s kind of into classic rock, and like I mentioned, the first wave of, European heavy metal. Mm-hmm. And at some point, I kind of found that independent music, and I was way into that. Bands like Husker Du, The Replacements, the Meat Puppets, the Minutemen. And I started going down that, and I kind of turned my back on my whole classic upbringing, which was kind of a shame. I got it back eventually. Yeah. But yeah, I think that was a really interesting point, because all those people were into the, they were like, punk influenced and, and pop influenced, and they sought out those classic instruments and made them, and brought them back into the forefront for anybody that was into that music. Yeah. So it's great. And you mentioned, like, there was BC Rich, which I kind of think of more as a 70s kind of like a guitar. But in the 80s, I'm trying to think of any guitars that came out during that period that were like went on to become classic. I think for some people, even though you and I might not get this, I think that Kramer, who started out in the 70s as a aluminum neck guitar, and then they went to after the Van Halen thing, they went to super Strat style guitars. Yep. But I think those kind of in their own right are classics, and they made a lot of those guitars without the Floyd Rose that were just like kind of super Strat, right? And those were cool. I always kind of liked those, the ones that were just like a dead Strat knockoff. Yeah, I thought those were cool, and I believe those are collectible. All this stuff is probably collectible. I know Ibanez gems are collectible now too, very collectible for some people. But I'm kind of looking for something that became another classic.
Well, I think Hamer guitars kind of are known in guitar circles as a cool classic guitar. Like if you get an 80s Hamer or a 70s Hamer, those are great guitars, man.
I agree.
So those are and they didn't do a lot of funky, to my recollection, they didn't do a lot of funky body styles. They
did for a while.
Did they?
And I was just going to mention that, because even companies like Guild, who were like a classic.
Guild went way off the rails.
Yeah,
man.
they had a pointy headstock kind of funky guitar.
And a pointy guitar.
Yeah.
Just, oh my God.
That moon-shaped thing, I don't remember the name of it. Yeah, so everybody, even Gibson. They had a super Strat with a pointy headstock. So everybody kind of lost their minds.
Okay, I'll cut everybody some slack for the weird body styles, but
Hamer's a good one, because they did start in the 70s, but they were really popular. People that we like took note of, like players of note, kind of adopted them in the 80s.
Yamahas, the double cutaway big. Remember, those were a thing in the 80s, 70s and 80s.
Yeah. They kind of kicked off in the 70s, but I love those guitars. You're talking about the
SG
2000s.
Yes.
Here in the US, they're called SBGs.
Yes, those ones.
Those are great guitars.
Yeah, and those are kind of a classic. I do too. But those are kind of a classic ones. So Hamer and those kind of I think of as. But again, like you're saying, I think some people consider these Ibanez guitars a classic guitar. I see people covet those Steve Vai. Guitars, those Ibanez bright colored things or whatever. But
PRS, I also have to mention that, though I'm not a super fan of PRS, they did. I'm looking through my old Guitar Player magazines, which I now collect. They come up like ads, and I never knew of their existence until the 90s. Yeah. When I was working in a guitar shop, I didn't give them a second thought. You know what I mean? Yeah. So that was one that you could argue. Let's talk about just gear in general. Like you're coming out of the 80s, and it's people are a lot of people are like kind of moving over to solid states. Not a lot, but there's a number of them that like Yamaha.
Well, there's a big solid state movement in the 80s, like huge.
Yeah. So people were doing that, but also that's where you get into that like the Bradshaw switching system in the rack, preamp and power amp. Yeah. People kind of went nuts on that for a while, and programmable. Effects. Like I'm not talking about the modern I'm talking about like the rack units that drives me nuts.
Totally, me too.
To try to figure that out, that tweaky, like you're setting up a giant Casio watch to get your sound.
Well, not only that, when you listen to those guitar sounds from those rigs, to me anyway, they sound like they're coming through some weird Casio thing, and there's no presence to the sound, or I can't say that across the board, but I'm recollecting these guitar sounds through these silly rigs, and it didn't sound to me it didn't sound organic, or it just sounded weird. It sounded processed and strange, and not appealing to me at all. But I think I think there's a lot of regret.
There's some I can't think of any. I have a huge stack of records right here, but I can't think of any. But I do know that I've fairly recently listened to a lot of records from the 80s, a lot of LPs, and a lot of them sound really good. They were still getting good guitar sounds, but I know what you're saying in general, like where the popular, like listening to the radio in the 1980s and where the sound was at. We talked about that in the Strat episode where, there was a lot of shitty keyboard, and guitar sounds were like very direct sounding into the board, and
like you're saying, there were a lot of great guitar sounds, but there were a lot of shitty guitar sounds. And like you say, those were a lot of the guitar sounds that were prominent because they were being played on the radio. And even like guitar players that we loved before went through this odyssey of even Alex Lifeson went through this whole thing of using Hughes and Kent, or he used outboard racks too. At one
I think
point
he still uses shitty stuff.
Pat Travers, all these dudes like that were using like just solid, Marshall stack with a frickin' Melody Maker. They went through this odyssey of play, and as we all do, but when you listen back to that stuff again, my favorite guitar tones from all these guitarists usually is their first guitar tone they had. You know what I mean? Like Eddie Van Halen, that first album, that sounds so freaking cool, man, because it's this untamed, breathing, cool guitar sound rather than this kind of formulaic sound that he ended up with. But anyway, that's yeah, I think you're right. There were a lot of great guitar sounds from the 80s, but also there were just a lot of silly rack-mounted ding-dongy things going on. Ding-dongs.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of anything else culturally on the gear front that was like in vogue.
Just the playing, like we talked about.
Yeah.
It's like the like you were saying, the bar for being a great guitar player, quotes, I'm using quotes, was your ability to tap or play really fast or do rake picking or all of these techniques that for you and I are just, parlor tricks, really. It's like the guitarists you and I love are guitar players that play tasty rhythm and then tasty leads, or, which again, I love guitar acrobatics and stuff like that.
In the context of what it is.
Yeah.
The other thing, if you take the shredding, and you remember another big phenomenon was the power ballad.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, where you have, the power ballad and the song almost basically stops so that they can shoehorn their solo that they worked out with all this tapping.
Of course.
That's a classic example, and I fucking love Eddie Van Halen. I mean, it's great. I'm not going to say, kind of a revolutionary guitar player. But, I mean, he got to a point where when I'm listening to some of those records, it's like that whole thing is like, okay, this song I'm going to use as a vehicle for the solo that I work. A Jump is a classic example. You've got this pop song, this infectious pop song, and it's time for the solo. Let's stop the whole fucking song, stick this solo in, and then, I'll use some of this horrible keyboard sound to bring us back in. It's like, it doesn't. It's not like at one with the song.
No, it's
like
not playing to the song. Yeah.
That I really like. I like playing around vocal lines and solos that just get you there. And there was a lot of great stuff then too. But yeah, that whole like I've had this solo for a while now. I need to stick it in a song somewhere. It's like you should get a solo from a song and not the other way around.
Yeah, and I agree. And I think a lot of the solos from that time period in the 80s were like that. It was just a chance for some dude to show you how he could tap or how, and it didn't necessarily fit the song per se, but it was just like, hey, look at me. I've got spandex and capezios and blow-dried hair and I can shred on my
Speed was the controversial in the guitar circle. Speed was a controversial like thing that people. I remember listening to, swear to God, in some magazine, listening to Al Di Meola bitch about players in speed. Like it's all they can do is speed. I mean, Mr. Fast Scale is like talking about.
Pretty ironic.
Yeah. I found that rather ironic. I'm like, really? So yeah, it was. Everybody was kind of up in arms about the speed race. There was a lot of people that were striving to be fast, and people were just talking about speed. I mean, Frank Zappa was another one that was kind of like, which is ironic again because he worked with Steve Vai a lot. But I remember him bitching about everybody's just all about speed.
Right.
So I'm not even really wired to critique somebody like Steve Vai or Joe Satriani. Because I just don't get that. I don't get what that is. And I know they have huge fan bases, so they're great. And somebody gets it, and I'm glad that they do. But, I'm just more of like, I take one greatly placed note over 20 anytime. So,
totally.
And a song. That's the thing about that. I mean, people like, I've had people who assume like, you play guitar? Here, check this Joe Satriani thing out. And I'm like, yeah, that's great, and he's got a good band, but... I don't hear a song.
No.
There's got to be a song to start with.
Because it's featuring him on guitar. It's not exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's cool. And I mean, there's joy brought to people who are a fan of that. But it's just like, and my whole point with that is like, I'm not going to really like jump on some wagon and start dissing that style of playing just because I don't get it.
Exactly.
So it sucks, though. I'll say that.
No, and I think I feel this exact same way. And for me, like as time has gone by, like when I was young, I was just totally like a fish to a lure, right? It was like there was a fast guitar player, flashy. I'm like, damn, that's amazing. How do I play that? But as you get older, like for me, the song just became the important thing. There are songs that I love that have no guitar solo whatsoever. It's just a great song.
Right.
I mean, and it doesn't need anything else, right? And as a musician, hopefully you mature and you go, and still, I still have a place in my heart for guys like Eddie Van Halen and Michael Schenker. But Michael Schenker, as we know, is a totally different animal altogether. But for shredders per se, I still have a soft spot in my heart for those players. But overall, I just prefer great songs over, whatever somebody considers to be great guitar playing, right? And that's another thing in guitar circles. It's like, wow, that guy's so fast. He's a great guitar player. It's like, well, he's fast, but how does that relate to being a great guitar player, really?
Right.
Technically, he can do all these things or she can do all these things, but what are they doing with it in terms of expressing some really beautiful musical expression, I don't know. But like you say, I mean, it speaks to some people, and a lot of people, for that matter, they go see those G3 things or whatever, where there's 3 shredders touring the world playing ultra fast stuff. But I'm the same way. I really just prefer a great song and tasty playing,
Right. And another thing we should mention, if we back up and we talk about, Slash kind of saving the Les Paul during that era. You also had someone like Stevie Ray Vaughan, who was kind of carrying the flame for the Stratocaster. So there's 2 classic guitars that were kind of like, keeping it alive during the Super Strat craze. So you've never owned a Super Strat, right?
I've never owned a Super Strat.
I've never owned a Super Strat.
No.
I don't even know if I've played one.
What is a Super Strat? Is it the
Super
humbucker?
Strat? Yeah, I guess we should establish what that is. It's a Stratocaster shaped body, because Stratocaster, let's face it, it's a comfortable guitar.
It is.
It's great. Everybody loves the Strat
Doesn't
style
poke my ribs.
body, and then it's got it usually has a humbucker in the bridge, and most often 2 other single coils. So you have a single coil neck, single coil middle, and the humbucker in the bridge. And it'll have, probably more frets for higher access, because you got to get way up there. You got to go higher than the last guy.
24 frets.
And it'll have some sort of like whammy system, either the Kahler or the Floyd Rose. So that, in my mind, is what the Super Strat is and was.
No, I've never owned a Super Strat.
And they made a shit ton of them. I mean, they were like cheap knockoffs.
Right.
And every company, I can't think of a company that. I probably could think of a company that didn't, but I mean, all the big ones. Fender, played around with. They had a Super Strat. Gibson had a Super Strat. You mentioned Hamer. Yeah. We mentioned Gill.
Charvel. Everybody.
Jackson.
Yeah.
So yeah.
I think you're right.
The other pointy headstock shape was the Randy Rhoads, like funny looking V style.
Right.
That was big for a while. And then V's. I mean, those V's and Explorers kind of had a little bit of.
Yeah,
a little bit of life there, but they want not just straight off the shelf. You got to have there got to be sharper points. that hockey stick head is okay for old guys, but we need sharp.
Yeah, we need to be able to impale somebody.
And and we definitely need it like the angles a little bit sharper, and we need some high output pickups. High output pickups were a thing that kind of held over from the 70s, because as soon as companies like DiMarzio started making hot humbuckers, everybody wanted one.
Well, and the morphing from Marshall, from that warm, cool, overdriven sound to the JCM 800 more metally sound is kind of one of the things I don't like about the evolution of that amplifier, because I just think, and again, there's some good sounding JC or
I like them, but
800s.
you're right. It's a little zingier on the top.
Which I don't. It just sounds more metally, more. It doesn't sound as warm and Which again is they're catering to a certain genre of music that wants to buy these amps, which is totally cool. But
and that's great that you mentioned amps, because what Fender did. And remind me, there's one other thing I want to say about Fender, but yeah, they went through that. Our whole classic line, and then in the '80s they started to switch it up a bit. We have like this new Harvard type thing, and then they got that Paul Rivera guy in there, and he took the designs and just like added a bunch of shit to them. Those are collectible amps. People like them, and they sound good, kind of in spite of how much shit is inside those amps.
Yeah.
So he must have known his shit, because he was able to put a bunch of crap in there and still make them sound good. Like he did the Super Champ, which is really kind of collectible, and I think he did a little bit for each model in the line and took it up. You remember the red knob Fender era?
Yes, I do.
Where they were tube, but they had those little tiny red knobs.
Yes.
The thing I was going to say about Fender in the '80s, I distinctly remember living in Lansing, Michigan. It must have been like 86 or 87, somewhere around there, and going into this guitar shop called Marshall Music in Lansing, and they had the new Fender line, the Fender Strats and Tellys, and looking, and they were all made in Japan. And I was talking to the dude, and I'm like, yeah. And at that time, this shop owner wasn't really sure that there was ever going to be. I mean, they didn't have a shop yet. They didn't have U.S. manufacturing set up yet. So he was like, yeah, that might be it for USA Fenders. It turns out it wasn't, and they were all the while they were working to get manufacturing set up. But I thought I trusted this guy's opinion, and I'm like, wow, that's it. And I had a USA Stratocaster, so I'm like, yeah, this is going to be worth so much money. But it was just for a short time. And if you wanted a new Stratocaster, Telecaster, they were made in Japan.
Yeah,
and they were made really well too.
Yeah,
I mean, Japan has always done really well with making guitars, especially in that era.
Yeah.
But I think they were at that time. They were really trying to we want to hold this Fender account. So they got the details on the reissues. They got the details better than the USA reissues. Like the 52 Telecaster, for instance, they did it better, as far as like attention to detail than the first USA version. So.
Yeah, they made some great guitars and continue to do so. But the 80s was an interesting time for guitar. And also, let's remember that the 80s was the dawn of new wave and all this other stuff. And people were saying, I remember literally people were saying, the guitar's done.
Pete Townsend he was a very vocal person who was saying that the guitar is on the way out. It's going to be synthesizers and
totally.
Yeah, I knew he was wrong then. You're still wrong, Pete. You're a good guy.
Yeah, I don't think I really bought into that either at the time, because I was a guitar player and I played guitar and I saw all this new wave stuff with all the synthesizers and stuff, but I never really bought into that. Like, the guitar's going to totally fall away from music, and sure enough, the big hair stuff came along, and then the indie stuff really surfaced, and then grunge surfaced, which brought grunge.
That still cracks me.
But grunge, love or hate it, was guitar oriented rock. That brought back amplifiers and guitars and all that other stuff, and so
that was the 90s though.
It
set it up in the late 80s.
It set it up,
and it was that first wave of independent music that you mentioned that got us there. I was really into that type of music, and that, guitars in there, like a lot of Gibsons and Fenders. So yeah, the classic guitar was saved in part by them as well.
I love it.
So
it's never going to die.
Yeah, my musical taste was. What was your musical taste back then?
Well, again, like you, I'm the classic rocker. That's what I was bred on. But then I did in the '80s. I got into a lot of new wave and a lot of indie music, and I kind of shed my '70s classic rock cred and love, and got into the whole new wave thing. As I got a little older and into the '90s and stuff, I came back, like you were saying, back into the more classic rock stuff and everything else. But yeah, I went down the rabbit hole of like, but I never played a synth or anything. I always played guitar, but I loved bands like the Split Enz and things like that were guitar. There was still a guitar prominently featured in their sound, but they were definitely new wave and weird, and then I guess I just liked guitar bands still that where guitars played prominently in their sound. How about you?
Kind of the same. I literally shed my classic rock at one point, because I remember that I went to a party and I brought my record collection. It was like, it took me 3 trips from the car. It wasn't huge, but there was a lot of records. over to this party, and we had this party over a weekend. And then I came home, and then it's like, yeah, just keep them. I left my records.
Dang.
It was like all my Zeppelin, all my classic shit. Because then I started a tape. My sister was sending me tapes of all these bands, like, I mentioned Husker Du,
right.
Replacements, and so I was way into that stuff. So, and I kind of like got really kind of a little snobby and turned my back on that. It didn't take very long before I realized, you know what, I can have that. And I can have this too.
Exactly.
And that was the other thing, is when I started playing in a band and I was into this kind of new independent music, I was thinking like, I want to write some songs. How am I going to write songs? And I'm thinking like, all these bands that I'm listening to I like, but the guitar is coming from a different, a lot of these people just picked up the guitar and started a band.
Right.
So, and I'd already been playing for a number of years, so I'm like, what am I going to do? And when I heard the Replacements, a light bulb went off. It's like, oh, I can keep my Aerosmith licks, and I can, so that was like the first band that told me it's okay to rock.
That's
and
cool.
use your stuff. So that was kind of an enlightening moment, and so that's when I started making music. That it was through those influences, and just started playing in bands, and then learned how to write songs. And I've always been classic guitars for everything,
I think that's so cool that you mentioned that. Exactly, you come to the realization that I don't have to like one or the other. I can like all this stuff.
Yeah.
And there's no taboo about doing that. I mean, I the same way. It's like I love all kinds of funky music that people probably wouldn't expect me to like, but I love it because it's just, there's too much music out there to say I only love like a couple genres or this genre or whatever.
Right.
But I have always been attracted to guitar rock because A, I grew up listening to that kind of stuff, and then B, I play guitar, and so I think I'm just drawn to that kind of music. But
and yeah, I mean, like we were talking about Pete Townsend talking about the demise of the guitar. I mean, now today technology where it is, I mean, you can sampling and whatever, but you're never going to find anything that sounds as much like a guitar as a guitar.
Right.
So I think and it's really amazing when you think about that the electric guitar, as it is and as it'll always be used, was pretty much perfect in, when it came out in the early 50s. So,
totally.
I mean, they got it right. I mean, the solid
did.
body electric guitar in the early 50s.
Amen. Thank you.
Yeah.
People like a Les Paul and
so
the Log.
The 60s didn't kill it. The 70s didn't kill it.
No.
The 80s didn't kill it. The 90s came close. No. The 90s didn't kill it. And the aughts and
I think,
aughts.
I think it still looks good for the guitar, man.
I think it's going to be around for a while.
And I think it's a kind of instrument that there's more to it than just being a musical instrument. There's so much psychology that goes, having this cool instrument slung around your body. You know what I mean? There's just this image of somebody like that, whether it's a woman or a man playing this thing on stage. It's just cool. That's the, the guitar player and the vocalist are the two, I think, people in bands that get the most love because there's just some romance about those two things.
They're gunslingers.
They're gunslingers.
Yeah.
Well, dude, I think that was a great convo about guitar in the 80s. And
thanks to you that suggested that, because we're always looking for ideas of shit to talk about. And that was a good one.
Yeah, keep those ideas coming, man. We definitely love it. And we really appreciate you guys for listening to this podcast. We appreciate you following us on Facebook and Spotify and iTunes. Yeah, and go there and rate us and give us some love. We would love it if you guys gave us
rate us if you're going to rate us well, though.
Yeah, only if you're going to rate us well. Otherwise, no, knock it off. But this has been another great episode of Chris and Rick Talk Guitars. That's Chris.
Hey.
I'm Rick. Until next time.
Thanks for listening.